Hello and welcome to Dialogue. The U.S. Supreme Court affirmative action ruling in college admissions has raised questions on the effects of diversity in both universities as well as in workplaces, legacy admissions, poverty, and so on. So how will the ruling affect future college admissions in the U.S.? Will minorities now have less opportunities in education and employment? And what's the road to true equality? To help us answer these questions and more, I'm glad to be joined by Professor Ray Baker of Towson University, Adolfo Franco, attorney and Republican strategist, and Gary Mao, core team of Highstreet. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qianduo. Welcome to Dialogue. We know the U.S. Supreme Court, the ruling against using race as a factor in admissions. First of all, I want you to share with us your stance on this ruling, so we know where you are. We can continue our discussion right after that. We'll start with Professor Ray Baker.
Yeah, the ruling was difficult for many in the United States from my perspective, and the reason it was difficult is because race is very much a factor, a part of our lived society. Our society functions and was written. A lot of our constitutional laws, although they do not explicitly mention race by name, although they do not identify black people, a lot of our laws are fundamentally written around anti-blackness. Some of the most pivotal United States laws coming in for our constitutional period, and even through the 1900s, when many in the United States thought that we were making our great ascension to become a global empire, many of those laws were written around race. And so for now, our Supreme Court to try to understand or interpret legislation and public policy as though we should not acknowledge or consider race feels a bit dishonest if we are ever looking to make whole the United States, if we're ever looking to be just in the United States. If we're not interested in justice, this ruling is fine. But if we are, unfortunately, this ruling sets us back quite a bit.
Okay, so it's a setback. So Adolfo, what's your understanding here?
Well, I couldn't disagree more with the other guest. In the first instance, there's something called the Equal Protection Clause of the United States, which means everyone should be treated equally and in the same fashion. And of course, anytime you are taking into account quotas and other factors in a rather subjective way, you're discriminating against one group. I think Chief Justice Roberts got it absolutely right. The way to end racial discrimination is to not discriminate on the basis of race. The problem with the other guest, he's absolutely right about the history of this country and the history of every society that continues to evolve. He would make a good case 100 years ago or plus, but that's just not the America of today in the first instance. And then secondly, it just say the approach that was being done should primarily be on merit, and other factors need to be taken into consideration. The fact of the matter is that if you eliminated the race here, boxes that people were checked, and you did this blindly, 95%, according to the case here, if you read it carefully, 95% of the Asian students who applied would have been selected. So you need to get the pool of candidates that have merit first, and then consider, among other factors, the personal experiences and if there was racial discrimination of the individual applicants. But this is just a fancy way of saying, I want quotas, and it's absolutely wrong.
Mm-hmm. Gary, so where do you stand?
I feel very, very torn on this subject, right? Because having been during the period of affirmative action, somebody that applied for college, and to be very honest, somebody that would think about this topic as an Asian American, like, would this help me selfishly, right? But at the same time, I think my stance on it is really a function of, it really depends on where the dialogue continues to go on after this ruling. Because the idea that you should use race, to me, purely like based on the color of your skin, should that impact or make a decision factor? I think that's an oversimplification. I think the lived experience, or like the first guest was saying, right, like the history and the biases that kind of disadvantage the population, that's what's trying to be compensated for. If it's purely a color issue, I think that's really, that's the way outdated thought. It doesn't really work today. And I think the notion, number one, is how can we include more of this, as Biden says, diverse thought into the class pool? And number two is, I mean, fundamentally, college is a scarce resource. So how do you divide it up, right? So if it's going more towards one race, of course, like if it's not towards Asians, we're gonna protest, right? If it's more towards Asians, other people are gonna protest. So from my stance, it's like, where can we continue to evolve this notion of bringing in the formerly disadvantaged groups instead of just letting the public be like, okay, it's all about color, because that's completely nonsensical in a way, to keep the dialogue on that basis.
Okay, justice, fairness, and equality. So Ray, here I think Adolfo raised the question. If we talk about, of course, we need to keep in mind this long history of racism in this country, and that's a reality. I would say there still are racist incidents there. But then again, I think Adolfo has a point. How long will such practice, of selecting students, with race as a factor, or preferential treatment for colored students, how long it will continue, and where is the end?
Well, the question needs to be raised as what counts as preferential treatment, right? Does legacy admission count as preferential treatment? Does a scholarship, as if you're an exceptional athlete, count as preferential treatment? Does merely being related to someone who donated large sums of money to a university count as preferential treatment? Because the way that this Supreme Court case was brought and the way this has been argued or framed as in the affirmative action cases is merely suggesting that race is a preferential treatment. However, Mr. Franco, and with respect to him, is oversimplifying the case and factually inaccurate when we look at questions of using quota systems in place to ensure that we have a significant percentage of African Americans. Your question of asking how long will this go in place is functionally asking, well, when do we have justice? How do we know we have reached a point of a just society? Each society, each community can determine for itself what it sees fit as a healthy and representative balance of its larger societal ecosystem. If the United States feels as though they have accomplished that, then I invite the United States to go ahead and do away with affirmative action considerations in the armed forces. However, we saw Chief Justice John Roberts talk specifically about not putting that there, putting that to the side, and although Justice Roberts alleged that it was because they were not a part of the plaintiffs and had not offered any commentary to this particular case. What he also alluded to was the question that so many national security leaders said that would be dangerous for morale and the function of the armed forces. That invites some uncomfortable questions about the society we look to build, and I'm interested in having that conversation. But again, returning to your initial question, how long must it go on? Well, and to quote Dr. Martin King, until justice rolls down.
Until justice rolls down. So Adolfo, so you think it's a time now we should enroll the students completely based on merit, based on talent, based on accomplishment?
Well, since we're quoting Dr. King, that's what he said. He wanted his children to be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. So the guests here and others, our guests, are very much anti-Martin Luther King in this regard. He never advocated for these affirmative action cases. This conversation, though, was what typically happens in this country. It's a mix of legal and philosophical and political, and they're all mixed up together. The first thing from a legal standpoint here, since you have other lawyers there, this is not new. This is built on the attacks the Supreme Court has had on these practices dating back well over 40 years ago in 1977 in the California Regents versus Bakke case that took on affirmative action. Since that time, the court really has chipped away, and universities have tried to manipulate and run the system not to run afoul. This just chips away more at it. Eventually, I believe the courts will eliminate these boxes and move toward a colorblind society that should be based on merit. I would think, we haven't talked much about merit. You asked, your question was the right question. Merit is and should be the first and paramount concern. Once you have a pool of candidates who blindly, as Dr. King would have wanted, qualify to be considered, that's what he wanted. The civil rights movement was based on the equal treatment and opportunity. And this is exactly what if you have the merit. Here, for an example, in our country, in the United States, there are many, many people that are white that would be excluded, although they're from Appalachia. They're from very, very areas of the country that they've suffered discrimination and certainly have not had the same equal opportunities. So it should be based on merit. We have to attack merit on other things, on education and so forth, which is a policy standpoint. From a legal standpoint, this is just completely indefensible, and the majority is absolutely right. It's the Equal Protection Clause of the United States does not prohibits discriminating against one group to favor another, and this is just a fancy way of doing it. Again, after you have merit, race and other factors in your background, according to this decision and previous Supreme Court decisions, are absolutely factors to be considered to achieve a more diverse student body. But they got it wrong in terms of the process.
Mm-hmm.
Universities do.
Okay, so Ray, if you follow this majority opinion, written by the Chief Justice Robert, basically, race will continue to be a factor to be considered in the process of enrolling students. So is that kind of a compromise to the, probably striking down for affirmative action here?
Well, my pushback to that is, and first I want to establish for your audience that our guest, Attorney Franco, is correct, that this is a mix of legal and philosophical. And the reason is because there's an ideological struggle in the United States right now for what kind of country we want to create. Principles of individualism are fair and valuable, and for much of what we've talked about, we see that the United States espouses individualism, but that is inconsistent in its application. One of the things we have to consider if we're going to talk about merit and admission processes are things like this. Does merit also mean we disqualify those candidates who may not otherwise be able to access a place like Harvard University, save but for the fact that they are legacy admissions? Does merit also disqualify those folks in Harvard application for Harvard University, save but for the fact that they or someone they are very close to have donated substantial sums of money to the university? If that is indeed the case, then I imagine Mr. Franco and I may be much more allies than otherwise your audience may assume us to be. As he advocates for those in Appalachia, I too advocate for those folks along class-based lines. And in fact, one might even make the argument in the United States, it was this betrayal of class solidarity among white Americans that have put us in this fractured position where race stands up as it is. A different conversation for a different day. Getting back to our conversation about the Supreme Court at this moment, if we are indeed looking to consider race as Justice Roberts told us to consider it, it would merely be an individual overcoming of race. However, every form of study, statistic, or research that we have in the United States, and particularly almost every American company, corporation, and institution in 2020, acknowledge that racism particularly, is a systemic issue. If it is a systemic issue, then individual accomplishment cannot overcome it. The way that you overcome systemic challenges is with reformation and or revolution and radical change of those systems. One of the things that we have to maintain is an intellectual and ideological consistency. If we're going to be inconsistent and apply individualism in some place and institutionalism in other places, then we're obviously going to have contested outcomes at every turn. Again, quoting our good friend Dr. King, that apparently Mr. Franco wants to quote as well, and I'm happy to unpack all of Dr. King's ideologies, including his rhetoric, and where do we go now from chaos or community, when he says there's rugged individualism for the poor, but socialism for the rich. When we think about 43% of white applicants to Harvard University specifically, and we only use Harvard as an indicator of what we can expect for some other institutions. 43% of those white applicants who were admitted because they were either on scholarship, they were related to someone who had made substantial contributions, they were children of faculty or staff, and or they were legacy admissions. One of the things we have to be honest about is if we're going to apply this sense of rugged individualism to black people, particularly black people, but all Americans, and we're going to tell folks to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, then why aren't we telling it to those who were born on third base yet seeing themselves as hitting a triple? I imagine those white Appalachian Americans would very much like those legacy candidates who may not otherwise have the grades to not take up that spot so they too could have that spot. And I think that's a broader conversation we should look to engage in.
I'm sorry, I have to add something to this.
Go ahead, Adolfo. Yeah.
On this quickly. I've heard this not a couple of times about legacy and donations and so forth. Now, the lawyers that are on this call, they know this. The Supreme Court is not a policy body, and it decides narrowly what is before it. the case. It decides narrowly what, and then you interpret what that means more broadly, what's narrowly before it in the Harvard and North Carolina University practices. That's what the Supreme Court decides. It's not Congress, it's not the executive branch. So if a lawsuit is brought on legacy, donations, and other discriminatory practice, I agree with Gary and the guests. I would say those do violate the law and do get preferential treatments. But to be clear, because many viewers do not understand this, the Supreme Court does not opine broadly. It decides what's narrowly before it, very narrowly as possible. And then from that, an interpretation is made. That's the first point. Secondly, America is not a racist country. America is not a systemically racist country any more or any less than any place in society. To say that this country is systemically racist when it has elected a black president is a stretch. All you need to do in American television, 17% of the American population is black. See how many television commercials, how many executives, how much access in the country is given. It's well over 17%. I'm of Latino background. We have a 13%, I'm sorry, is black, 17% is Latino. You have a completely different makeup of the Latino community. So I think most Americans know and feel there is not a disparate or unfair treatment of black people. However, what is the problem very quickly here is social economic problems. You have a large percentage of the African American community that is fatherless, and there are all kinds of social problems that need to be addressed. But this is not some imposition of 1950s or prior law, legislation, Jim Crow to discriminate against black people. Everybody knows it's nonsense, including the current vice president of the United States, who's black, and the former president.
Mm-hmm. Gary, go ahead. So you are Asian. And there are many questions here about what do you think of this merit issue, this color of race, a legacy admission. For example, obviously, I think most people would say that's not fair, and the ultimate goal for any society is fairness, is justice, is equality.
To a certain extent, I think it kind of pierced a bit to hear, right? But it's true that there is this narrative out there that, oh, this Supreme Court case was brought forth because of Asian American action. Well, I mean, there is parts of the fact where that may be true, but at the same time, I think Asian Americans kind of in recent racial politics role almost have this unfortunate double agent kind of perception where, okay, we're a minority like everyone else. Factually, this is true, but somehow we're perceived as not I guess the model minority, right? Oh, we are a minority, but we don't understand the perils or struggles or negativity that maybe the others have, right? And therefore, there's this implied kind of war that's kind of being bought for us that as much as we want to help, as much as we want solidarity, and in many cases, like I said, I could see the merits or the spirit of affirmative action. There's this assumption that well, you shouldn't even be in the conversation. Oh, your SAT scores are so high, or oh, these like that. That's where I think I have the biggest problem amongst all of this is the fear that we're kind of almost just like this puppet. And let me be clear with this too. Do Chinese people, Asian Americans, do my parents care that I went to a good university? Of course they do. They would look down on me if I couldn't make certain scores or things like that. So of course, the affirmative action is a hot button topic that we would, our self-perception of our values kind of almost touch upon this world, right? But at the same time, to take those vulnerabilities and have a media story spun around that we are kind of double agents, that we're a minority that wants to fight against diversity is really, I think, the worst part of this whole subject in a way.
It's not against diversity. Asian students aren't against diversity. Asian students are for equal treatment. Equal protection that's guaranteed by our Constitution. They're saying they have merit and they have been excluded because of racial discrimination. That's exactly what the majority opinion said. And the majority opinion is right. Asian students were being discriminated. It's perfectly clear. The justification the other guests have made is, well, we have to pay for sins in the past. We have to make more equal. So it's okay to discriminate against Asians. That's the conclusion. You cannot get around merit. You cannot get around merit. Once people have merit, then diversity and other factors should be considered. If you're not doing that, you're discriminating. You might say that's good public policy. I disagree.
Mm-hmm.
So if
Well,
I exactly a bit actually with a quick point is I think that there's a bit of like a smoke screen on the focus of the academic institution, assuming it's fixed. Because like I said, like admission to Harvard, we always talk about that. Ray mentioned it and I agree. Like somehow the name Harvard always comes up. Harvard only has so many seats, right?
mm-hmm.
I think what Adolfo, Ray we would all agree, I'm pretty sure, is that if everyone could get really good at high quality education, and this is a very like Silicon Valley concept, right? It's like, how is it that we still have this notion that there's like trash universities and then there's amazing dream universities, right? And when you have that like small like gatekeeping opportunity, it doesn't matter if affirmative action exists or it doesn't. You're always going to have legacy, like they said. You're always going to have people fighting or optimizing. I can definitely tell you too, like here in China, there's like the whole education consulting industry, right? You pay more money to get more assistance, whether it's higher test scores, learning how to. I can promise you, people hack the SATs, right? Like that's not really demonstrating your IQ. That's truly there's ways to pass it, get a high score without really, being fitting the spirit of that test. I'll put it that way. And so whenever you're going to have that like room of scarcity, there's always going to be people that are going to hack it. And so the question I think I always ask myself in this particular case is, why don't we ever make a discussion on like how to make these resources more widely available, as opposed to assuming that we always need a war over this small amount of seats that we will always fight for the rest of time if it always remains scarce.
Mm-hmm. Let's shift a little bit to the topic here. Professor Ray Baker, what will be the impact in terms of recruiting students for schools like Harvard, like University of North Carolina now with the ruling? So will there somehow be impacting the diversity?
To answer your question, we're going to see a drop in the number of African American students that are at these institutions. The reason that we can say that with such confidence is because in 1995, when the University of California system no longer used affirmative action in race as an indicator in which to include in their admissions process, we saw a significant drop in the number of African American students in that population. Particularly, we saw a significant drop in the number of non-white students there, but on account of some of the Hispanic American students who are beginning to migrate through the University of California system, the number of non-white students are beginning to tick up, but the number of black students, the diversity with black students is particularly still low.
If you look at the impact of this ruling, there are concerns, I would say, whatever you call it. People are looking at the potential impact on the workplace, for example, the diversity of workplace, of hiring people. In the past and now, the practice is like, of course, color of skin is a factor to be considered in terms of hiring A or B. But with such a ruling, so people see there will be an impact on the hiring practice too. Is that the case?
Oh, I don't believe so. Because I think, as our guests have mentioned, there is this philosophical element to this whole discussion. The key word I would say that would summarize, I guess, my view on this is the word enforcement. Because when it comes to philosophy, you can't look at somebody and they don't say a word, or even you talk to them for many, many hours. You may not know what drives their internal logic, right? Like there's a term like microaggressions or kind of, that silent form of like passive racism, right? And I think, as Adolfo said, there's this kind of fundamental issue that people would discriminate on certain characteristics that aren't necessarily merit-based. And whether you have this legal title or not, people can always do it in sneaky ways, right? In the Silicon Valley, where I grew up, if you look at the big tech firms out there like Facebook, Google, etc. I mean, of the populations where I live in that town, amongst the Indian population, East Asian, probably like Chinese, Korean, Japanese, there's always discussions whether you're the hirer or the one being hired or potentially being promoted. Like casually, just at a bar, people talking with each other like, oh, well, so-and-so I'm going to hire because of this guy's from my hometown, or this guy is of this race. Oh, XYZ, insert this stereotype here. Now, can you control that or make that illegal? No, because of course they're never going to write that in evaluation. They're never going to publicly admit to those things. But can those things be used silently? Of course it can. Like And so that's why I say the enforcement part is just so hard, right? Like to the point where at least when affirmative action was there, you could probably eke out some of that publicly. But now that you're saying, okay, this is not an issue, people can do it silently anyways.
Mm-hmm. Well, Adolfo, if you look at the reality, whether there's systemic racism or not, but if you see there's, for example, poverty associated with a particular group of people, ethnic minority, but there's a problem. Whatever you call it, I mean, maybe, college enrollment is not the way to solve the problem. What is the way forward to solve this, inequality issue?
Well, I mean, this is the human condition. This is not going to be I don't want to go down a philosophical thing. And I think Ray said he wanted to talk about other societies, China included, and others. The nature of human beings is inequality. It is not going to be an equal basis for everybody. Everybody's not born the same. Everybody's not born fit. Everybody's not born, unfortunately, with two arms and the rest of it. People have all kinds of issues and so forth. So there's not going to have this perfect society. It's just not going to happen. And you're certainly not going to legislate it and have public policy. However, that's not an excuse not to give opportunity. To answer your question. You have to create investments and opportunities to make sure that everyone has equal opportunity. That was the message of Dr. King, by the way. That's the fundamental message, and that is the access to everybody having it. Even that is unequal, even among the same groups. And since let's talk about the so-called white population, which seems to be the one that's signaled as privileged, or even Asian that's privileged. Within those groups, as I mentioned, Appalachia, rural America, whatever, there's great disparity in rural Mississippi versus somebody white that's growing up there and on the east side of Manhattan in New York. So that condition is a human condition. Again, that's not an excuse not to make those investments. The answer to it is not reducing merit standards and having quotas be the driver. I may be clear on this program. Affirmative action was really killed by the Supreme Court in 1977 and by the American people through referendums and propositions, including, as I mentioned, California and other states for the last 45 years. This is just another way that these universities are trying to manipulate to get a certain diversity into their student bodies, and they will continue to do it in this case. This is not the end of this issue. Other cases were brought against these same universities and others for not following the dicta, that means the instructions of the Supreme Court. They will try to do it now to say, well, we looked at personality and so forth. Until we eliminate this racial boxing that we put in little boxes of your race and judge people on merit, we're not going to have a changed society. I want the best airline pilot, not the most diverse. And I'm a member of a minority group. So I want the most talented people, whatever race they are, to give them those opportunities. And that has nothing to do with the admissions process. It starts much earlier.
Thank you, Adolfo. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks again to you guys. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.